Everybody dies, don't they? Everybody come back, don't they? Isn't that so?
You tried to get into the locked room today, didn't you?
How do the dead come back, Mother? What's the secret?
The Red Room by H.G. Wells. I can assure you, said I, that it will take a very tangible ghost to frighten me, and I stood up before the fire with my glass in my hand. It is your own choosing, said the man with the withered arm, and glanced at me askance. 28 years, said I have lived, and never a ghost have I seen as yet. The old woman sat staring hard into the fire, her pale eyes wide open. Ah, she broke in, and 28 years you have lived and never seen the likes of this house, I reckon. There's a many things to see when one's still but 28. She swayed her head slowly from side to side. A many things to see, and sorrow for. I half suspected the old people were trying to enhance the spiritual terrors of their house by their droning insistence. I put down my empty glass on the table and looked about the room, and caught a glimpse of myself, abbreviated and broadened to an impossible sturdiness in the queer old mirror at the end of the room. Well, I said, if I see anything tonight, I shall be so much the wiser, for I come to the business with an open mind. It's your own choosing, said the man with the withered arm once more. I heard the sound of a stick and a shambling step on the flags in the passage outside, and the door creaked on its hinges as a second old man entered, more bent and more wrinkled, more aged even than the first. He supported himself by a single crutch. His eyes were covered by a shade, and his lower lip, half averted, hung pale and pink from his decaying yellow teeth. He made straight for an armchair on the opposite side of the table, sat down clumsily, and began to cough. The man with the withered arm gave this newcomer a short glance of positive dislike. The old woman took no notice of his arrival, but remained with her eyes fixed steadily on the fire. I said, "It's your own choosing," said the man with the withered arm, when the coughing had ceased for a while. "It's my own choosing," I answered. The man with the shade became aware of my presence for the first time, and threw his head back for a moment and sideways to see me. I caught a momentary glimpse of his eyes, small and bright and inflamed. Then he began to cough and splutter again. "Why don't you drink?" said the man with the withered arm, pushing the beer towards him. The man with the shade poured out a glassful with a shaky arm that splashed half as much again on the deal table. A monstrous shadow of him crouched upon the wall and mocked his action as he poured and drank. I must confess I had scarce expected these grotesque custodians. There is to my mind something inhuman in senility, something crouching and atavistic. The human qualities seem to drop from old people insensibly day by day. The three of them made me feel uncomfortable, with their gaunt silences, their bent carriage, their evident unfriendliness to me and to one another. "If," said I, "you'll show me this haunted room of yours, I'll make myself comfortable there." The old man with the cough jerked his head back so suddenly that it startled me, and shot another glance of his red eyes at me from under the shade, but no one answered me. I waited a minute, glancing from one to the other. "If," I said a little louder, "if you will show me to this haunted room of yours, I will relieve you from the task of entertaining me." "There's a candle on the slab outside the door," said the man with the withered arm, looking at my feet as he addressed me. "But if you go to the Red Room tonight—" "This night of all nights," said the old woman. "You go alone." "Very well," I answered, "and which way do I go?" "You go along the passage for a bit," said he, "until you come to a door, and through that is a spiral staircase, and halfway up that is a landing and another door covered with baize. Go through that and down the long corridor to the end, and the Red Room is on your left, up the steps." "Have I got that right?" I said, and repeated his directions. He corrected me on one particular. "And are you really going?" said the man with the shade, looking at me again for the third time, with that queer, unnatural tilting of the face. "This night of all nights," said the old woman. "It's what I came for," I said, and moved towards the door. As I did so, the old man with the shade rose and staggered round the table so as to be closer to the others and to the fire. At the door I turned and looked at them, and saw they were all close together, dark against the firelight, staring at me over their shoulders with an intent expression on their ancient faces. "Good night," I said, setting the door open. "It's your own choosing," said the man with the withered arm. I left the door wide open until the candle was well alight, and then I shut them in and walked down the chilly, echoing passage. I must confess that the oddness of these three old pensioners in whose charge her ladyship had left the castle, and the deep-toned, old-fashioned furniture of the housekeeper's room in which they foregathered, affected me, in spite of my efforts to keep myself at a matter-of-fact phase. They seemed to belong to another age, an older age, an age when things spiritual were different from this of ours, less certain, an age when omens and witches were credible, and ghosts beyond denying. Their very existence was spectral. The cut of their clothing, fashions born in dead brains, the ornaments and conveniences of the room about them were ghostly. The thoughts of vanished men, which still haunted rather than participated in the world of today. But with an effort, I sent such thoughts to the right about. The long, draughty, subterranean passage was chilly and dusty, and my candle flared and made the shadows cower and quiver. The echoes rang up and down the spiral staircase, and a shadow came sweeping up after me, and one fled before me into the darkness overhead. I came to the landing and stopped there for a moment, listening to a rustling that I fancied I heard. Then, satisfied of the absolute silence, I pushed open the baize-covered door and stood in the corridor. The effect was scarcely what I expected, for the moonlight, coming in by the great window on the grand staircase, picked out everything in vivid black shadow or silvery illumination. Everything was in its place. The house might have been deserted on the yesterday instead of 18 months ago. There were candles in the sockets of the sconces, and whatever dust had gathered on the carpets or upon the polished flooring was distributed so evenly as to be invisible in the moonlight. I was about to advance and stopped abruptly. A bronze group stood upon the landing, hidden from me by the corner of the wall, but its shadow fell with marvellous distinctness upon the white panelling and gave me the impression of someone crouching to waylay me. I stood rigid for half a minute, perhaps. Then, with my hand in the pocket that held my revolver, I advanced, only to discover a Ganymede and eagle glistening in the moonlight. That incident for a time restored my nerve, and a porcelain Chinaman on a buhl table, whose head rocked silently as I passed him, scarcely startled me. The door to the Red Room and the steps up to it were in a shadowy corner. I moved my candle from side to side in order to see clearly the nature of the recess in which I stood before opening the door. Here it was, thought I, that my predecessor was found, and the memory of that story gave me a sudden twinge of apprehension. I glanced over my shoulder at the Ganymede in the moonlight and opened the door of the Red Room rather hastily, with my face half turned to the pallid silence of the landing. I entered, closed the door behind me at once, turned the key I found in the lock within, and stood, with the candle held aloft, surveying the scene of my vigil, the great Red Room of Lorraine Castle in which the young Duke had died, or rather in which he had begun his dying, for he'd opened the door and fallen headlong down the steps I'd just ascended. That had been the end of his vigil, of his gallant attempt to conquer the ghostly tradition of the place, and never, I thought, had apoplexy better served the ends of superstition. And there were other and older stories that clung to the room, back to the half-credible beginning of it all, the tale of a timid wife and the tragic end that came to her husband's jest of frightening her. And looking around that large sombre room, with its shadowy window bays, its recesses and alcoves, one could well understand the legends that had sprouted in its black corners, its germinating darkness. My candle was a little tongue of light in its vastness that failed to pierce the opposite end of the room and left an ocean of mystery and suggestion beyond its island of light. I resolved to make a systematic examination of the place at once and dispel the fanciful suggestions of its obscurity before they obtained a hold upon me. After satisfying myself of the fastening of the door, I began to walk around the room, peering round each article of furniture, tucking up the valances of the bed and opening its curtains wide. I pulled up the blinds and examined the fastenings of the several windows before closing the shutters, leant forward and looked up the blackness of the wide chimney, and tapped the dark oak panelling for any secret opening. There were 2 big mirrors in the room, each with a pair of sconces bearing candles, and on the mantelshelf, too, were more candles in china candlesticks. All these I lit, one after the other. The fire was laid, an unexpected consideration from the old housekeeper, and I lit it to keep down any disposition to shiver, and when it was burning well, I stood round with my back to it and regarded the room again. I had pulled up a chintz-covered armchair and a table to form a kind of barricade before me, and on this lay my revolver ready to hand. My precise examination had done me good, but I still found the remoter darkness of the place and its perfect stillness too stimulating for the imagination. The echoing of the stir and crackling of the fire was no sort of comfort to me. The shadow in the alcove at the end in particular had that indefinable quality of a presence, that odd suggestion of a lurking, living thing that comes so easily in silence and solitude. At last, to reassure myself, I walked with a candle into it and satisfied myself that there was nothing tangible there. I stood that candle upon the floor of the alcove and left it in that position. By this time I was in a state of considerable nervous tension, although to my reason there was no adequate cause for the condition. My mind, however, was perfectly clear. I postulated quite unreservedly that nothing supernatural could happen, and to pass the time I began to string some rhymes together, Ingoldsby fashion, of the original legend of the place. A few I spoke aloud, but the echoes were not pleasant. For the same reason, I also abandoned after a time a conversation with myself upon the impossibility of ghosts and haunting. My mind reverted to the 3 old and distorted people downstairs, and I tried to keep it upon that topic. The sombre reds and blacks of the room troubled me. Even with 7 candles, the place was merely dim. The one in the alcove flared in a draught, and the fire's flickering kept the shadows and penumbra perpetually shifting and stirring. Casting about for a remedy, I recalled the candles I'd seen in the passage, and with a slight effort walked out into the moonlight, carrying a candle and leaving the door open, and presently returned with as many as 10. These I put in various knickknacks of china with which the room was sparsely adorned, lit and placed where the shadows had lain deepest, some on the floor, some in the window recesses, until at last my 17 candles were so arranged that not an inch of the room but had the direct light of at least one of them. It occurred to me that when the ghost came, I could warn him not to trip over them. The room was now brightly illuminated. There was something very cheery and reassuring in these little streaming flames, and snuffing them gave me an occupation and afforded a helpful sense of the passage of time. Even with that, however, the brooding expectation of the vigil weighed heavily upon me. It was after midnight that the candle in the alcove suddenly went out, and the black shadow sprang back to its place there. I didn't see the candle go out. I simply turned and saw that the darkness was there, as one might start and see the unexpected presence of a stranger. "By Jove," said I aloud, "that draught's a strong one." And taking the matches from the table, I walked across the room in a leisurely manner to relight the corner again. My first match wouldn't strike, and as I succeeded with the second, something seemed to blink on the wall before me. I turned my head involuntarily and saw that the 2 candles on the little table by the fireplace were extinguished. I rose at once to my feet. "Odd," I said. "Did I do that myself in a flash of absent-mindedness?" I walked back, relit one, and as I did so, I saw the candle in the right sconce of one of the mirrors wink and go right out, and almost immediately its companion followed it. There was no mistake about it. The flame vanished, as if the wicks had been suddenly nipped between a finger and thumb, leaving the wick neither glowing nor smoking, but black. While I stood gaping, the candle at the foot of the bed went out, and the shadows seemed to take another step towards me. "This won't do," said I, and first one and then another candle on the mantel-shelf followed. "What's up?" I cried, with a queer high note getting into my voice somehow. At that, the candle on the wardrobe went out, and the one I had relit in the alcove followed. "Steady on," I said. "These candles are wanted," speaking with a half-hysterical facetiousness and scratching away at a match for the while for the mantel candlesticks. My hands trembled so much that twice I missed the rough paper of the matchbox. As the mantel emerged from darkness again, 2 candles in the remoter end of the window were eclipsed, but with the same match I also relit the larger mirror candles and those on the floor near the doorway, so that for the moment I seemed to gain on their extinctions. But then in a volley there vanished 4 lights at once in different corners of the room, and I struck another match in quivering haste and stood hesitating whither to take it. As I stood undecided, an invisible hand seemed to sweep out the 2 candles on the table. With a cry of terror I dashed at the alcove, then into the corner, and then into the window, relighting 3 as 2 more vanished by the fireplace. Then, perceiving a better way, I dropped the matches on the iron-bound deed-box in the corner and caught up the bedroom candlestick. With this I avoided the delay of striking matches, but for all that the steady process of extinction went on, and the shadows I feared and fought against returned and crept in upon me, first a step gained on this side of me and then on that. It was like a ragged storm cloud sweeping out the stars. Now and then one returned for a minute and was lost again. I was almost now frantic with the horror of the coming darkness, and my self-possession deserted me. I leaped, panting and dishevelled, from candle to candle in a vain struggle against that remorseless advance. I bruised myself on the thigh against the table. I sent a chair headlong. I stumbled and fell and whisked the cloth from the table in my fall. My candle rolled away from me, and I snatched another one as I rose. Abruptly, this was blown out as I swung it off the table by the wind of my sudden movement, and immediately the 2 remaining candles followed. But there was light still in the room, a red light that staved off the shadows from me. The fire! Of course, I could still thrust my candle between the bars and relight it. I turned to where the flames were still dancing between the glowing coals and splashing red reflections upon the furniture, made 2 steps towards the grate, and incontinently the flames dwindled and vanished. The glow vanished. The reflections rushed together and vanished. And as I thrust the candle between the bars, darkness closed upon me like the shutting of an eye, wrapped about me in a stifling embrace, sealed my vision, and crushed the last vestiges of reason from my brain. The candle fell from my hand. I flung out my arms in a vain effort to thrust that ponderous blackness away from me, and lifting up my voice, screamed with all my might, once, twice, thrice. Then I think I must have staggered to my feet. I know I thought suddenly of the moonlit corridor, and with my head bowed and my arms over my face, made a run for the door. But I'd forgotten the exact position of the door, and struck myself heavily against the corner of the bed. I staggered back, turned, and was either struck or struck myself against some other bulky furniture. I have a vague memory of battering myself thus to and fro in the darkness, of a cramped struggle, and of my own wild crying as I darted to and fro, of a heavy blow at last on my forehead, a horrible sensation of falling that lasted an age, of my last frantic effort to keep my footing, and then I remember no more. I opened my eyes in daylight. My head was roughly bandaged, and the man with the withered arm was watching my face. As I looked about me, trying to remember what had happened, and for a space I could not recollect, I rolled my eyes into the corner and saw the old woman, no longer abstracted, pouring out some drops of medicine from a little blue phial into a glass. "Where am I?" I asked. "I seem to remember you, and yet I cannot remember who you are." They told me then, and I heard of the haunted Red Room as one who hears a tale. "We found you at dawn," said he, "and there was blood on your forehead and lips." It was very slowly I recovered my memory of my experience. "You believe now," said the old man, "that the room is haunted?" He spoke no longer as one who greets an intruder, but as one who grieves for a broken friend. "Yes," said I, "the room is haunted. And you have seen it, and we who have lived here all our lives have never set eyes upon it, because we have never dared. Tell us, is it truly the old Earl who—" "No," said I, "it is not." "I told you so," said the old lady with the glass in her hand. "It is his poor young countess who was frightened." It is not," I said. "There is neither ghost of Earl nor ghost of Countess in that room. There is no ghost there at all, but worse, far worse." "Well," they said. "The worst of all things that haunt poor mortal man," said I, "and that is in all its nakedness, fear. Fear that will not have light nor sound, that will not bear with reason, that deafens and darkness and overwhelms. It followed me down through the corridor. It fought against me in the room." I stopped abruptly. There was an interval of silence. My hand went up to my bandages. Then the man with the shade sighed and spoke. "That is it," said he. "I knew that was it. A power of darkness, to put such a curse upon a woman. It lurks there always. You can feel it even in the daytime, even of a bright summer's day, in the hangings, in the curtains, keeping behind you however you face about. In the dusk it creeps along the corridor and follows you so that you dare not turn. There is fear in that room of hers, black fear, and there will be, so long as this house of sin endures." If you like that story, consider supporting me as a patron. That way you help me make more stories for you and get access to a patrons-only library of stories. Lots more hours for you to listen to.
You tried to get into the locked drawer today, didn't you?
How do the dead come back, Mother? What's the secret of the dead come back?
That was The Red Room by H.G. Wells. Remember last week I did The Tapestried Chamber by Sir Walter Scott. So I'm actually doing a series of room ones. There'll be more to come, obviously. H.G. Wells, Herbert George Wells, born 1866, died 1946, known to readers across the world as H.G. He was born in Bromley, Kent in 1866, and he was a writer of remarkable range and prescience, best remembered today as a founding father of science fiction. Yet to label him simply as such is to understate the complexity of a mind that combined the rigour of scientific thought with the fervour of political idealism. We'll get into all of this briefly later. I've done The Time Machine. Great story. It's on this channel somewhere if you look for it. I might try and link it. Nobody listens to it. There's certain stories I do, like Phantom of the Opera, Time Machine, absolute classics, Frankenstein. Nobody listens to them, and they're beaten hands down by vile AI-narrated versions. Now, let me just be really clear about what I think about AI narration. I don't mind it. It's like, it's like going to a cheap restaurant. They can just churn out tons of audiobooks. The quality isn't great, but if you don't want good quality, if you want to have really poor quality spam, luncheon meat, then that's what you want. I see myself more as an artisan. So there we are. So I'm not against it, and if people want to, there are channels like Gates of Imagination, massive amount of audiobooks out there, and they don't do that free. I've got an idea of what it must cost them to produce all these things, but they clearly make the money back in the amount of listens, and I feel what do I say? I think if you go into a Heron Foods, for example, which is a cheap supermarket chain, you know what you're going to get. You can't afford better. You know, you're happy with that, and it keeps you alive, and that's great. But if you, this is a dangerous metaphor, really. I'm kind of messed it up a bit. But if you go to a big posh like Waitrose, we don't have them in the north of England, actually, not this far north anyway. We have the equivalent is booths, I suppose, is as close as we get, and we don't even have booths this far north. But if you go to Keswick, about 20-30 miles south, you can, and Penrith, so about 20 miles south, that's as far as booths comes up, and we certainly don't get Waitrose. But you know, I hope you're not lost. So I'm not against it as such, as long as you know what you're buying or not buying, what you're getting for free. Anyway, so yeah, he was a fantastic writer, really. He had fragile health and modest means in his early years. His father, Joseph Wells, was a part-time shopkeeper, that is to say, kept a shop, and a cricketer. He was a professional cricketer who earned his living, but not full living, because he had to run a shop as well. And his mother, Sarah Neal, worked in service, so she was the servant. You know, like you watch your Downton Abbey. She was one of the people who clean your toilet. I don't know if she was a toilet cleaner. She maybe was because there's different ranks of servants as well, you know. The scullery maids and the butler are, you know, worlds apart. You know, and he was impressed. I mean, coming from that background, he tended to side with the ordinary people, but he was clearly awed by the grandeur, as we all are, you know. And I have thoughts about if there weren't massively rich people, most of the artistic treasures of the world wouldn't have happened. So, you know, whereas it would be lovely if everybody was okay and, you know, had plenty of money, and there wasn't this inequality, but we have to recognise that much as we may dislike it, the concept of it, immense wealth has created immense benefits for them, but trickle down. You may debate this. I mean, I'll give you an example where there were the Kerwin family in Workington, where I grew up, and they had a hall. It was this. It went back centuries and centuries and centuries, like hundreds and hundreds of years. And in the 1930s and 40s, it was a remarkable place. And these people were descended from the Earls of Allerdale, probably going right back into post-Roman times, or at least early medieval times, that these people owned this land. I'm not just sticking up for them. I'm just saying that this was kind of like an artifact, a historical artifact, the family and their property. And then they fell on hard times. Second World War, there was a conscious decision to tax the landed gentry through the death duties, and it destroyed a lot of their estates. And I think it was designed to do that in part as well. And the local council was a Labour council, so they said after the Second World War their priority was creating homes for ordinary people, and we can admire that. But that meant that this castle, this hall, fell to rack and ruin, of which it is today. So I think, you know, it's possible to keep contrary things in your mind, isn't it? On the one hand, you can deplore inequality and poverty, and you can admire artistic and architectural and historical splendour as well, you know. And you could then say, well, we can't have one without the other. And I'm not here to talk about that, really, because I don't know enough about it. But, you know, so there we are. And H.G. Wells, so this all started by a thought by his mother being in service and him being impressed by the grandeur and hierarchy, and he was a socialist. He was a socialist anyway. He was a bright lad, and he secured a scholarship to the Normal School of Science in London, where he studied biology under T.H. Huxley, leading Darwinian of the day. Don't say H. It's very, very wrong. This grounding in evolutionary theory and the mechanics of life later underpinned much of his fiction. He then had to go and find a job, so he worked as a draper's apprentice, not a very grand job, but, you know, not it's a job. And he was a school teacher and a journalist. And so this says his experiences furnished him with the first-hand insight into the struggles of the English lower middle class, and didn't just furnish him, but that was his life, you know. It wasn't he was an observer, he was living it, you know. So he did these novels, Kipps, 1905, and The History of Mr. Polly, 1910. And he's in this period, his writing straddled the line between reportage and narrative, and he became a better writer. But then, of course, he starts writing science fiction. The Time Machine, 1895, fantastic story. And Class Division and Entropy. There we see it, the Morlocks and the Eloi as well. The Island of Dr. Moreau, 1896, fantastic. Shout of Debates on Vivisection confronted the ethics of science and fragile boundary between human and animal. The War of the Worlds, 1898. He turned the tables on British imperialism. Did he? Maybe. Imagining a technologically superior Martian invasion of England as a mirror to colonial conquest. Maybe not, maybe. I don't know, actually. My notes say that. I don't know if he was actually sitting out to do that. Anyway, Invisible Man, 1897, First Man on the Moon, 1901. So what a guy. He was unorthodox in his personal life. He married his cousin, Isabel Mary Wells, in 1891. And that didn't last very long. 1895, he married Amy Catherine Robbins, who he knew as Jane. Of course, I'm John Anthony, known as Tony, so I can't complain about that. Although I would argue that Tony has some connection with Anthony, whereas I don't see Amy Catherine Robbins being Jane. He had 2 sons with her. She died in 1927. He felt that very deeply. However, he may have loved her. This is this idea about having 2 things in your mind at the same time. However, he had affairs outside marriage and had children with other women. Anthony West, with the novelist Rebecca West, and there was another one as well, which I've lost somewhere in my papers. And he grew increasingly disillusioned in his later years. The horrors of 2 world wars dimmed his faith in rational progress. You can see him coming into the modern period as a scientist aficionado, and he, this idea that we had this idea, didn't we? That I've said this before, actually last week, that what we were promised by the Enlightenment was we would understand everything. Everything was understandable, and therefore everything was controllable. And once we controlled things, the nature, the universe, we would deploy that for human good. So, Keynes, the economist, Milton, he thought that by this time there would be so much generated extra wealth in the world that it would be spread equally amongst society and we would all just live lives of leisure. But actually what happened was the very, very rich said, I want all of it, and you can't really have it. And we're going to do what we can through our agenda of maximising our own profits and impoverishing you, who we don't really want, insofar as you just work for us. And if we break you, we'll get another one. And if we can replace you with a robot, we'll do that. We'll get somebody from a poor country, and we won't pay them as much because they don't realise you can't live on this until they break, and we'll get another one. There we are. So I'm probably relatively politically aligned with Wells in that, really. But I never actually believed in that story that we could know everything, therefore control everything, and that would lead to the goodness of human nature. I've experienced enough walking the dogs of very unpleasant people to know that there's a good... There are some lovely people out in the world, but there's some really unpleasant ones as well. So there we are. What that all had to do with H.G. Wells, other than a vehicle for me ranting, I don't know. Poor old H.G. Wells, he deserved better, really. Let's talk about this story. The Red Room, 1896. So it's in this time when he's really pumping out stories. I really liked this story. Okay, so I want to say that there was slightly the end. It was a little bit flat for me, but the way nothing much happens, but the Gothic grotesquerie of it at the beginning, the withered retainers, the man who's coughing all the time, the one with the withered arm, the weird old woman, they are just like something out of the Shakespeare, aren't they? The weird sisters, and they're very much in the Gothic tradition of bizarre servants. So it's very Gothic, I picked up this castle was maybe in France. And it's basically been abandoned by the owner because it's haunted. That's just such Gothic tropes, which I love anyway. And there's no electric light, obviously. It's all candle lit. It's just Gothic to the core. Loved it. And I loved his descriptions. one of the things I said, and you may have heard me say this, is you've got there's an agia, which is a rhetorical technique that the Greeks spoke of. You need to put your reader sensorily, through their senses, in the place. You need to use sensory description to make your reader inhabit that place. And once they're in the place, they're going to feel the emotions of the place. This is relevant to what I'm going to say shortly. So if they're not there, they're not going to feel it. Just think about a thriller. If you're not actually in the car with your avatar, the protagonist, you don't really feel the fact he's being shot at, or the car wheel's going to fall off, or you're going too fast, or anything like that. You don't feel it. So you've got to put people there. So if you're going to put people in the haunted room, you need to do this. And I thought he did it so well. Nothing much happens in this story, yet he paced it so fantastically that nothing much was built up. And it reminded me very much of oral storytelling, whereby if you've ever been with an oral storyteller, and if you haven't, you should go to a good oral storyteller, somebody who's going to tell you a story while you're in the room, because they read you and they play it back, and they've got techniques to make you feel things, and they pause and they hurry and they pause and they... and that is the technique of storytelling. I think he just absolutely fantastically does that. So, nothing much happened in the stories. There is, we've talked about this Gothicness. He is the rationalist, of course. This is a trope. This is a commonplace. The rationalist doesn't believe in ghosts, goes into the haunted house, and generally is converted, as in this case. So that isn't particularly original. If I say it fell flat, let's go on a little bit and you'll see what I mean. Let's talk about how the ghost stories come out. So what you have is the early Gothic stories. Talked before, Castle of Otranto, 1764, Anne Radcliffe's The Mysteries of Udolpho, 1794, so it's 30 years later. Anne Radcliffe was massive. She was, the best-selling, she was the Stephen King of her generation, but she specialised in two things really. One is the Gothic romance. So apart from just being Gothic horrors, there's usually a romantic part of it, and it's usually a female protagonist. There's usually kind of an evil but handsome and compelling bad boy narrator. You see these in the alpha werewolf billionaire stories these days that are pumped out on Amazon. It's the same thing. And she was a pioneer of that, but also she was a pioneer of something else, which was the explained supernatural. So the Scooby-Doo effect, really. It is to say everything is set up to sound as if it's supernatural, and then as we get further on, it's not supernatural at all. And we've got to see this. I mean, I've said many, many times this tension in those centuries between the romantic view, which is to say there's an awesomeness, a numinosity to the world that is not understandable. It's awe-inspiring, it's divine, spiritual, if not religious, spiritual. And then the other view, which is this scientific view, which says everything can be understood, will be understood in the fullness of time, and will be controlled in the fullness of time. There's always been, for the past 200-300 years, there's been this tension in Western society between those two. And I think in Western society, really. So this makes Anne Radcliffe lean towards, at the time when the rational was in the ascendancy, you were thought of as a weak-minded fool to believe in the supernatural. So you have to go, it's explained. And this is what Wells almost does here. And I don't know if it's a strength or a weakness of the story that's not completely resolved. So let's go on a little bit. So the other thing to say about the genesis of the ghost story is we start with these immense blockbusters. Castle of Otranto isn't that big, but most of the Radcliffes were like these sci-fi, the fantasy trilogies or the sci-fi space operas were massive doorstoppers of books. And then what happens is the ghost story or this kind of supernatural story becomes a short form. So how did that happen? So onto stage Mr. Edgar Allan Poe, 1809, 1849. So he was writing in the 30s and 40s, and he's instrumental in this transition from the long-form Gothic saga to the short story. I mean, we have like a novella-length stuff like The Fall of the House of Usher, but The Telltale Heart is pretty short. Mask of the Red Death is relatively short, and he is producing this stuff in the in the 40s, 1840s. And then we have another guy who did a lot for this form is Charles Dickens. Charles Dickens, again, does books that will break you if you get hit by them. But he produces The Signalman, 1866. A realist tone, moving slightly away with The Signalman from the luridness of the Gothic sagas I've been talking about to a more realist thing that's happening in the real world, very much like this one here, which is decades later, of course, but it is the Gothic, but it is sort of a bit more believable. It's a bit more it could happen to you, dear reader, and then we have Sheridan Le Fanu's Green Tea. So what we have is happening is the form is getting shorter. And this is related to the growth of periodicals and Christmas annuals that were collections. So people wanted a smorgasbord, if you like. You want to pick it up and it's got a whole bunch of different stories in rather than big one long piece. And so whether that was because that's what people wanted to read or they read it because that's what they were served up with, it's always hard to know. But probably led by the expectation of I've got time to read a shorter story, so I'm going to buy a Christmas annual or a periodical that contains various shorter stories. I can read one in an evening, put it down, next evening read another one, okay? So the form is getting shorter. This idea of the supernatural versus the mundane. So in the early days, of course, they don't have psychology. Anne Radcliffe doesn't have psychology. But as the 19th century advances, the growth of the study of the human mind, not just the human brain, but human behavior understood as psychological, as a mechanism, as a process that can be studied scientifically, that starts to grow. And we get this idea that a ghost... So in the early ones, it's like it's either a ghost or it's trickery, yeah? That's the early stuff. As we get psychology, we get stories that are suggesting it's either a ghost or it is a process of the human mind, usually understood as madness. So you're either mad or it's real, so and then you think of things like The Turn of the Screw, classically The Turn of the Screw by Henry James, towards the end of this period, so, and you can see this develop, 1898, just this is the ghost real in that story, or is the governess mad? And so this is, 1898 is The Turn of the Screw, this is 1896, written in 1894, is the same thing. Is this and Le Fanu's Green Tea, 1869, which is a bit earlier, is the same thing. Le Fanu is the greatest ghost story writer of his generation, I think. I think we have Poe, then we have Le Fanu, Henry James, potentially. Then we have, and Edith Wharton to an extent. I'm a big fan of Edith Wharton, of course. And then we have M.R. James, and you can see these are the masters of their generation, I think. And so this idea, as I said, is it psychological? And I think, so what I'm going to say is where the story falls a bit flat is, it's not... Because if you say it's psychological, what's blowing the candles out? So I don't think he comes down on either side. And that may be seen as a weakness if it's not neat, really. I'm a M.R. James guy. If we go to M.R. James a bit later, M.R. James there's no question, it's not psychological. They're supernatural. No question about it. And I prefer that myself rather than the psychological. And so with Turn of the Screw, I prefer the explanation that it is ghosts. But obviously not everybody does. So I kind of like to think that this Red Room story was actually a ghost. Now, he makes fun of that, I think, when he goes back to the retainers and they find him with his bandaged head, because the end of it could have been just him just rushing around the panic, battering his head against the wall in the dark. Or it could have been the ghost. But I think we're led down the line of, it's him psychologically, he's just panicking. And he makes fun of the retainers, because one of them says, was it the Duke or the Earl? No, it's not the Earl. Okay. Oh, it's the Countess then. These are kind of classic Gothic tropes, aren't they? You know, a ghost is going to be the White Lady, the Grey Lady, and it's going to be Countess Anne of Summerfield, which is a supermarket chain. And, you know, he rejects those. He's making fun of that. This Gothic, yes, it is the Duke of Earl, but then he says, no, the ghost is fear. So, is fear merely anxiety that is self-generated, that has no reference to the outside world? So we these days we are kind of really keyed in to understand anxiety as being frightened when there is no external cause for it. Fear is when you see a tiger coming at you, that's fear. A man with a knife, yeah, that's fear. That's not anxiety, that's fear. Look, you know, whereas anxiety is you walking down the dark streets and there's no man with a knife and there's no tiger, but you still feel anxious. So you still feel that fear emotional. That is anxiety, and I think that's how we understand it. And I think H.G. Wells is offering us that this is just a guy who's... The whole set and setting is keyed him up to feel anxious, and that's all it is, merely a psychological problem. But I think the final end is a personification of fear as almost a demonic thing. I may be going too far with this, but I think the retainer puts forward that the house is soaked in fear. Yes, it isn't a ghost, it is fear, but fear personified as some kind of entity. And that's my take on it. So, as normal, I use that as a springboard. I wish I could springboard at the end rather than springing off all the way through and springing back again. But I want to turn to one of my go-to guys, which is Gaston Bachelard. He was a French philosopher. We need to say something about the history of philosophy as well. Oh, it's not going to be too long. Basically, there are two kinds of philosophy in this. Let's go a bit further back. So what we have is the Enlightenment. Keep going on about the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment starts off with the rational observation of the world. So there are two ways of understanding the world. One is philosophy, which is trying to work out through logic, through reason, of what is true. Now, the downside to that is philosophers are still arguing about the same things and haven't come to a conclusion by using reason. About 3,000 years after the Greeks, 3,500 years, we're still no further forward with most of the things. So the scientists amongst you might laugh at the philosophers and say, look, reason doesn't work. You've just been arguing about the same things using your reason. So that was reason as a method of inquiry. The other one is what you used to call them natural philosophers, because they were philosophers trying to understand the world, but they measured things. So they would look at all the different kinds of plants, all the different kinds of elephant, and put them in order. Or they would measure how long it took a cannonball to fall off the Tower of Pisa. Or they, so it was all about, and the idea was that the facts out there are objective. So if I do an experiment, I have a theory, I test it, but I measure it. And if I come up with a result that suggests one way or the other, you, where you live, should be able to do exactly the same thing. And if it is true, you will get the same result. That, interestingly, most experiments are not completely replicable. They don't seem to work faultlessly. So there's something wrong with that theory. But by and large, it has been hugely successful. And the world we live in is a result of scientific, empirical reasoning. Right? Okay. Let's leave science and its successes to one side. Let's go back to philosophy. The people have been arguing for 3,500 years. And we'll rush a bit further forward and we'll talk about the current division in Western culture, which is between what they call Anglo-American or Anglo-Saxon philosophy and continental philosophy. That's the Germans and the French and Italians, Russians, but mainly the French and the Germans, really, and Austrians. So what we have here is the Anglo-American philosophy is tied very much to this empirical idea, positivism, which was, of course, an Austrian idea to start off with. But the Anglo-Americans are very keen on reason and rules and no nonsense. It's all objective. It's not going to be how you feel about things. Whereas the French particularly, and the Germans, they got really into how you feel about things. So one is about, on the side of, so if we can't measure it, we can use mathematics, which is sort of like measuring. It's reason. It's closer to, to what we call quantitative data. It's not quite quantitative, but it is sort of. It's logical and it's out there. It's objective, yeah. Whereas the continentals are all into how things feel, right? Now you know that, we can go back to Gaston Bachelard, who's a Frenchman, and he wrote this book called The Poetics of Space, except in French, and it's about architecture and imagination. So Bachelard, rather than treating houses and rooms as inert backdrops to experience, he approaches them as dynamic spaces that shape, reflect, and evoke states of mind. So it isn't just the question of my state of mind. It is a reciprocal thing. A place will evoke a state of mind in me, and my response to that state, that place, will reshape it, What I mean by that is, think of the London Dungeon, which is all those people dressed up with blood and things like that, and toy guns, toy swords. That has an effect on me, the decor, the way it's set out, but it only exists because of my wish for that effect. So it's like we're not separate from the places, it's a reciprocal. I hope I've explained that. So a house, let's look at Bachelard, I think he's really interesting, is not merely a shelter. It's not just a place we shelter, but one of the greatest powers of integration for the thoughts, memories and dreams of mankind. That's what he says. I think he's right. Each part of the dwelling, furthermore than our personal memories of particular houses, each part of a dwelling carries a distinct symbolic weight. The attic, high and orderly, often represents reason and abstraction. The cellar, by contrast, lies beneath consciousness. It is dark, damp, irrational, a domain of fears, secrets, and the primal. Just look at ghost stories. Actually, the attic can be a place for things like that as well. And he says these aren't just cultural associations. He says that these spatial responses are felt pre-reflectively. Therefore, you have them before you think about them on the level of reverie or dream. So it is in that pre-thought stage. Yeah. So a corner can conjure solitude or entrapment. A corridor becomes a transitional zone of suspense. Like the man in this story walking down the corridor, it is leading us. We feel our suspense growing as he proceeds down this corridor. That's what corridors are. The corridor to the dentist, the corridor to the surgery, the corridor to the exam room, the corridor to the courtroom. A corridor to the airport. We experience a corridor as a transitional, where there's a build-up of emotion, and at the end it's dissipated unless we go to some other room. Yeah. So I don't think he's wrong, is he? The cellar in particular fascinates Bachelard as a metaphor for the unconscious. It's a place we descend into. One that exists beneath the realm of order, in which we explore with both curiosity and dread. To descend into the cellar, he writes, is to dream of going deeper. But this descent is also shadowed by fear. In a cellar, one feels watched by the darkness itself. In such spaces, fear does not require an apparition or incident. It arises from the resistance of the space to being fully known or possessed. You can see how the Anglo-American philosophers are just spitting their coffee out at this. It's just humbug, buff. I made that word up, buff. Architecture, because this is Bachelard again, becomes not a container of the story, but a generator of affect, i.e. feeling. Wells's red room with its cold stone walls, recesses, drafts, and unfathomable shadows resonates powerfully with Bachelard's insights. The fear the narrator feels is not prompted by an event. This is Bachelardian ideas, but by the room's refusal to yield itself to light and understanding. This is what Bachelard calls the poetics of architecture, a way in which space, through its form and atmosphere, engages the imagination in a dialogue of presence and absence, memory and forgetting, comfort and dread. In Gothic fiction, as in Bachelard's phenomenology, We won't even get into phenomenology. That's another great idea, great thing. The hauntedness of a space is often less about who died there and more about how the room is felt. This is exactly what Wells is saying, I think, how it speaks to the unconscious fears already present in the one who enters it. Really important. It's prompted by, but if you're not frightened of things like that, you can't be frightened. You've got to go there with that potential in you. Because you get the skeptics and you'll get people walking in and they're just not scared because they don't have it in them to be scared. You have to have it in you before it can flower, some dark fungal flowering, some fruiting bodies. I read Mexican Gothic, fruiting bodies in cellars. Enough said. So it's about how it's felt, isn't it? So I think this is absolutely fantastic, but I want to kind of reference another book which I've been reading recently. I haven't finished yet. Two guys called, I got this at Orkney in the bookshop of Maze Howe, which is Bronze Age, I think, maybe older, tomb, rediscovered by the Vikings 1,500 years after it was built, and they put Viking graffiti and runes on it. It's a fantastic place if you go to Orkney. Anyway, they've got a bookshop, not in the tomb, in a shop, in a visitor centre. I got this book called The Neolithic Mind, written in 2005 by David Lewis Williams and David Pearce. And they in the book, basically, they look at the Atlantic megalithic culture, monuments. Actually, Maze House is really similar to Douth in Ireland. If you look at, I remember looking up, and oh, that's just the same. And then you have the Near Eastern culture, which you find in kind of what is today Turkey, Mesopotamia, and Jericho and places like that. And they talk about how they found these Near Eastern houses with skulls buried beneath the floors, often under hearths or sleeping platforms. Now, in some cases, I think in Jericho, they had they put the skull in plaster and put cowrie shells for eyes. So these were deliberately done, and they buried the ancestors underneath where they slept. So this idea of an axis whereby the world of the dead and the underworld is in the cellar, is beneath us, is archetypal, really. It's deep in us. It's not something that we decide to think. It's something pre-existing. This is the idea of archetypes, So, and I think this is absolutely fantastic. So this Red Room is a real good example of that, I think. And it leaves unresolved the idea of this fear. What is it? Is it merely psychological? Is it explicable in terms of the psychology of the individual? Or is it something that exists in the room itself? And that's one of the things when I was leading ghost hunts way back now, I was always fascinated by is these places, these sacred sites, if you like, and we go to a lot of sacred sites now, but haunted houses really, in my day when I was doing these things, the feeling that you get from them, do you bring it there or is it there already? Or is it, both of you? I think some people are more open to these things than others, definitely. In the same way I'm colourblind, I can't see certain colours. Certain people are, and other people can see certain colours. I think certain people can, like Sheila, can feel and see energies that I can't. There's two other things I'm not going to have time to talk about, both of them. One is psychogeography, which I think is really interesting, and it's sort of related. It is a Venn diagram with Bachelar's Poetics of Architecture. But the other thing is environmental psychology. I've said something about, there's a lot to be said about environmental psychology. I'm probably not going to say too much about it other than to say that the whole science of psychology is looking at the human mind and its processes as objects of empirical study, so things that can be measured, things that can be, experiments can be run on them. And so it's not just like, in many ways, psychoanalysis was looked down on by psychology because it's what they call non-falsifiable. So Freud or Jung have a theory, Melanie Klein has a theory, and you go, like Bachelard really, you go, like continental philosophy, you go, well, that sounds really plausible. That sounds like it might be true, but there's no way of testing it. It might be true, might not be true. How are we ever going to know? So the way that, of course, psychoanalysts work is they collect case studies, and then they attempt to be scientific in that way by having a lot of case studies and looking for commonalities between them and patterns of behaviour. But it can shade into proper psychology, whereby it's. I mean, I did a psychology degree, and I was disappointed at the amount of maths in it, and particularly statistics, and trying to work out whether something was statistically significant. But I think it's worth doing. I'm all in favour of psychology, to be honest. And the environmental psychology is a sub-branch of it, and it looks at how physical surroundings, like houses, like haunted houses, castles, whatever, how they impact human behaviour, perception, cognition, emotion, and social interaction. So this is environmental psychology. It probably started in the late 60s, 1960s, a guy called Kurt. You might say Lewin, but if he's German, it's Kurt Lewin. Well, if he's American, it's Kurt Lewin. He's German-American, so I reckon when he was born, it was Kurt Lewin, and then he became Kurt Lewin. And he puts it into mathematical stuff, because remember I said scientists, they like maths. So and his theory is E in brackets colon B equals small f open parentheses P comma E close parentheses. That's all you need to know. Where the person is the P, the environment is E, and you just measure it like that. I don't even understand what formula, but there's all things like, ecological psychology. Roger Barker in the 40s and 50s developed the concept of behaviour settings. I'm not going to do this justice because there's an awful amount to say about this, but I think to wrap up what we've been saying, the story talks about a person's experience in a reputedly haunted room, and it is approached with a certain amount of skepticism and a rationalist viewpoint, and that is evident. I mean, I think he deploys the Gothic tropes, but I think he makes fun of the idea of, is it a countess, is it a duke, and I think he's poking fun, and we're led down the path of this scientific way of looking at it, that it's the effect of the place, and it's the pre-conscious effect of the place, the pre-thought effect of the place. It's just the impact, and it turns out that this has been approached both from the rationalist point of view through environmental psychology, whereby they will do experiments on places like Mary King's Close. They'll measure the damp, they'll measure the light, they'll measure the confinement, the size of the rooms, they'll look at the population group, they'll do experiments, and then they will accept the qualitative data of the person's experience, but it will be done because you have to if you're a psychologist, because that's what you're measuring. But and also we looked at the kind of more continental way of looking at it, which is just to accept it in a more poetic way, and look at the impact of places on the feelings of people and have theories about it, but in a probably non-scientific way, really. Fascinating stuff, but there's a ton more to say about environmental psychology, there's a ton more to say about psychogeography, there's a load more to say about Gaston Bachelard's poetics of architecture in space, and isn't it interesting that we can get a plain simple ghost story and we can dig all this stuff out, and the fun is just thinking about it. I think it's like going to the gym. Why do you go to the gym? Is it for the results? Well, one thing they say about, I go to the gym, one thing they say about it is, if you're just looking for the results, you're not going to carry through. You have to be in love with the process. You have to enjoy the process, or else you're not going to keep doing it. And this is the process of thinking about things. That's what we're doing. We're getting stories and we're thinking about them, and we're merely enjoying thinking about different ways of approaching a story, in the same way as my Jasper loves to roll on his back down a grassy bank, a grassy slope. He loves doing that. And why? Well, why not? Same with us. Why not? Why not talk about these things? Hope you did enjoy it anyway. Okay, I'll be back, as you know, soon.
Everybody dies, don't they? Everybody come back, don't they? Isn't that so?
You tried to get into the locked drawer today, didn't you?
How do the dead come back, Mother? What's the secret?